I became involved in this through friends who had become aware that there was a project that would involve nuclear waste being possibly buried north of Thunder Bay. There were a few people that knew about it, but their concern was not enough people knew about it. And my work and my passion is in publicity. So I got into this because I thought it just wasn't right that people didn't know that this might be coming, and I might be able to help with awareness. So along the way, learning more about the issue myself, I became quite passionate in opposition because I don't believe it's wise to bring it here. The township of Ignace, which is the one basically being given the power of consent or veto on this project, launched a willingness project. They call it the Willingness Project this year. And it wasn't to gather information on willingness of the people for the project, yes or no, but to learn how they wanted to be able to express their willingness. Did they want surveys? Did they want events? Did they want a vote? The Willingness Project was conducted through, it itself was an event of a type, and the way they reached out to the public I thought was inadequate. They had information tables that weren't announced. Some of them were good ideas, like having information tables near vaccination clinics. That gathered a lot of input for them. But because people couldn't anticipate them and go out to them, and because they were quite public, because you couldn't chat candidly with the person at the table who was gathering data, I don't think the data from those is very valid. In the end, when the project was reported on in the fall, I had a consultant agency that was carrying it out, and they had determined through these various means that the people of Ignace did not want a vote, did not want a referendum, that the people would prefer that the council speak for them on this issue. So they're being denied the opportunity to have a vote, and that decision has now been made by council. Township of Ignace hasn't made a decision yet for or against the project. It's anticipated that they may make that decision in 2023, and that there is another site in South Bruce that's also under consideration by the NWMO, and they have the same issues. In their community, they've decided that there will be a vote, which seems more equitable. And if both areas vote yes and everything else goes well, NWMO can then choose between them, I suppose. And they are hoping to make that siting decision in 2023. So all these issues are becoming quite urgent. The very odd thing in this whole process to me is that the township of Ignace has been singled out by NWMO as the community that has the right to consent or veto, whether it's through their people's vote or via their council. Ignace has a population of about 1,000 voting individuals. Dryden, which is almost equidistant from the proposed site for the nuclear waste burial, has at least 5 times that big a voting population, and yet they've never been mentioned as a community that can have a say in this. They are now becoming more active and becoming more aware, and I'm hoping that's partly through the activities of our group that they've become more aware, so they may get onto the radar. It's not right that a small community like Ignace, that's not even in the watershed of the proposed project, as Dryden is, as Kenora is, as Grassy Narrows is, that such a tiny community has the vote for all of us in this region, even all of us along the transportation route from southern Ontario. All these people are affected, and the small community of Ignace is to have the vote on this. And the reason it's being done that way, I think, is obvious, that Ignace is a small, economically vulnerable community, and NWMO is pumping money into their community. And if I were NWMO, I would do the same. But as much as I'm sure individuals in that community are glad for that funding and say, well, it won't affect our opinion on this, we're all human. Of course it will. I'm concerned about the amount of money the NWMO is pumping into these mostly economically vulnerable communities, especially Ignace, but they're also doing the same now in Dryden. They're funding various good projects around the community. They're funding things in Thunder Bay as well. Number one, did the ratepayers that paid that money in the beginning mean it to be used to persuade people that nuclear waste burial in their community was safe? I don't think the people that paid their hydro bills meant the money to be used that way. That's one question. And the other is, simply the question of what it does when a lot of money flows into a community. Um, it's bound to be persuasive despite the best of intentions, and I think that's why the NWMO spends so much money in the communities, not out of goodwill, but to persuade, and I find that offensive. Another concern I have is how this type of issue splits communities, and especially with the money involved. This has happened in South Bruce. There's been a lot of commentary down there about it, and it's happening in Ignace. People telling us that they're not on good terms with their neighbors anymore because they have different opinions about this project. That kind of scar in a community it'll be generational. It's quite fundamental, and it's sad. Regarding the consent of the Indigenous community, which is very important, I've recently learned a bit more about, it's got a funny name, UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And I've recently learned that because Canada has endorsed that declaration of the UN, it sits in a position above our federal law. And there are very specific stipulations in that declaration about the rights of Indigenous people, to do with developments on their land and to do with this kind of development quite specifically. So they do have quite a bit of power in the consent or veto of this project, but I'm not sure they're aware. I'm really concerned about that. I know the NWMO, which by the way is an association of nuclear power producers, so they're not a third party with no interest in this. They produce actually very good educational materials, but they're slanted towards the safety of this project and the benefit of this project to communities, which, those are subject to question. They're going into Indigenous communities nearby with education. I know they're doing that. And I'm not sure the rest of their activities. I just know that I feel that's biased information that's going in there, and I don't know what other pressures may be exerted in Indigenous communities. We have friends who are members of these communities, and mostly what we hear when they speak to their associates and their neighbors there is that they haven't heard that this is happening. And that's very alarming because they're a very important part of this decision. I believe this is, it's not a decision for a small group of people nearby the repository site, the proposed site. This is at least an issue for a whole region because of the effects of if this material were to get into the watershed, that's a very wide area. And, the transportation route is another thing again. So I think at the very least, the communities in Northwestern Ontario in general should be consulted. Dryden should be consulted. Thunder Bay should be consulted because this waste would be traveling through Thunder Bay on its way up north if it travels by truck. So just a much wider sector of the population needs to be consulted. And I think the best way to do that is through a vote and not through councils, because they may not necessarily represent the people. Not all councils work all that well. There are no easy solutions to this nuclear waste. I mean, there is no good answer to dealing with nuclear waste. We don't feel it should be buried in the bedrock here. We also don't think it should be buried in the rock in Southern Ontario. We favor a solution called rolling stewardship, which is storage near the site of production. So most of this would be in Southern Ontario, but not right on the lake shore where the nuclear power plants are, a little bit inland of that. The nuclear waste doesn't take all that much space. I forget what they like to quote in terms of football fields, and it's not a lot. Once it's packed up for transport, it's a lot of bulk, but the waste itself is not that big. So it's not a space issue. It's an issue of who doesn't naturally want it nearby. But it's in Southern Ontario already, and I think the best idea is to keep it there, not transport it. It can be put in hardened containers and monitored as much of it is right now, monitored safely, and that responsibility passed on to future generations to do the same. I'm afraid what we see happening here is NWMO being able to operate by their own playbook, so to speak, because there's no precedent for this kind of project where a large agency will go in with such dangerous waste or such a dangerous product, need to persuade a community to accept it, pump money into the community. I don't think these things are right, but the Nuclear Waste Management Organization can just use their own playbook here because it hasn't been done before. With the provincial elections coming up, we feel a new sense of urgency about getting awareness of this issue out to the community. We hope people will speak to their candidates and, as always, share the information about this project, this potential project with their neighbors so that they know. And find out what the candidates think and vote accordingly, of course. Candidates and anyone can get information from our website, wethenuclearprenorth.ca. There's lots there, there's lots of reference material, and that's where you'll find the facts you need.